Hello and good morning, everyone. This is our third session of tort law, and my name is Yasir Kulfraz, and today we will discuss, understand vicarious liability, and describe the tests and establishing vicarious liability. So let's get started. Can you see my screen? Can you hear my voice? Okay, so indicative content, definition of the doctrine, liability for act of third parties, effect of vicarious liability, position of cause, temporary agency workers, and priests, etc. Need for tort to be committed in cause of employment. Gravel versus Carroll's and Oral Case Law, 2008, development of close connection test Mohammed versus W.M. Morrison 2016 and Morrison versus various claimants 2020. Key terminology. Before we dive into the topic of vicarious liability, let's go over some key terms that will help you understand it better. Employment, employer-employee relation, scope of employment. Uh, the wrongful act must have been committed while the employee was performing their job duties. If it happens outside of work, the employer may not be reasonable. Strict liability. In some cases, the employer is held responsible even if they did not personally do anything wrong, so long as the act was connected to the employee's job. Respondent superior, this is a Latin phrase meaning let the master answer, which means the employer is legally responsible for their employee's action while on the job. Independent contractor, a person who works independently and is not a company employees. Uh, Here is a link for video. I want you to all watch this video on vicarious liability, copy and paste on the uh, on the Google, and you can watch this link. It will provide real world examples and further clarify how courts apply this. Uh, Understand vicarious liability. It is legal rule that holds an employer responsible for wrongful act committed by their employees while doing their job, even if the employer did not personally do anything wrong. They can still be held accountable if the employee's action or job related. This rule is common in tort law, which deals with legal claims for harm or injury. The idea behind vicarious liability is to ensure that responsibility falls on the right people, mainly those who control and benefit from the employee's work. Key elements of vicarious liability. For vicarious liabilities to apply, three main conditions must be met. There must be an employer relationship. The person who committed the wrongful act must be an employee, not an independent contractor. The act must be committed within the scope of employment. The action must have taken place while the employee will doing their job. The nature of the act should be related to the job. The wrongful act should be something that can be linked to the employee's responsibilities. If these three conditions are met, the employer can be held responsible. Any questions so far? Right. Test used in establishing vicarious liability, control test, and integration. Control test, this test looks at how much control the employer has over the worker's task and behaviors. If the employer decides whether, when, where, and how the employee works, it is likely an employment relationship. If the employer can discipline or fire the worker, this also points to an employment relationship. Example, a truck driver working for a delivery company follows strict company guidelines on deliveries. If the driver causes an accident while on duty, the employer could be held responsible. Integration organizations test. This test checks whether the worker's rule is a core part of the business or just an added service. If the business cannot function properly without the worker's rule, they are more likely to be considered an employee. If the worker is separate and not essential to the company, they might be an independent contractor. Example for this test is a hospital employs full-time surgeon since surgery is central to the hospital's purpose. The hospital can be held responsible for the surgeon's negligence during an operation. Any questions so far? Right. Right. Next one is economic reality multiple factors test and close connection test. This test considers various factors to determine whether a person is an employee or an independent contractor. It looks at how the workers paid, salary, pre-project payment, who provides tools and equipment, how much independence and worker has in completing tasks, whether the workers pay their own taxes and insurance. Example, a worker who is paid hourly use company tools and follows strict company's policies is likely an employee. However, a freelancer who sets their own hours and use their own tools is likely to independent contractor. Close connection test. This test determines whether the wrongful act was closely linked to the employee job. If the act helped while the employee was carrying out their duties, the employee may be liable. The employer could also be responsible if they could have reasonable predicted that such an act might occur. Example for this close connection test: a security guard working at a nightclub assault a customer during working hours. Since security guards are hired to handle conflict, the employee might be held responsible for the guard's action. Case law examples. Uh, Here are some real life cases that have shaped how vicarious liability is applied. Lister versus Hasley Hall Limited 2001. The issue was a residential school employee committed acts of abuse. Was the school responsible? Outcomes: the court ruled that the school was vicariously liable because the wrongful acts were closely connected to the employee's duty. Ready Mixed Concrete Limited versus Minister of Pensions 1968. The issue was a truck driver, an employee, or an independent contractor. The outcome was the court used the economic reality test and found that the driver was an independent contractor, meaning the employee was not liable. Mohammed versus W.M. Morrison Supermarket 2006. Issue was a supermarket employee assaulted a customer. Was the employee responsible? Outcome: the court held the employer liable because the act was closely connected to the employee's job. Any questions so far? Conclusion for this section: vicarious liability is an important legal principle that ensures employees take responsibility for their employees' work-related actions by applying tests like control test, integration test, economic reality test, and close connection test. Courts can decide whether an employee should be held liable. This concept not only protects victims but also encourages employees to create safer workplace and properly supervise their employees. Any questions so far? Define vicarious liability. Uh, Vicarious liability is a legal rule that make an employer or principal responsible for the wrongful actions of their employees or agents. However, this applies only if the wrongful acts happens with the employees is during their job. Even if the employer did not personally commit the act, they can still be held accountable because they have control over their employees and benefit from their work. This rule is mainly used in negligence and tort law, helping victims receive compensations from those who have the financial ability to pay. Key features of vicarious liability: relationship requirement: there must be a connection between the employer and the person who committed the wrongful act, usually an employer-employee relationship. Act within scope: the wrongful act must have been done as part of the employer's job. No need for direct fault: the employer does not have to personally commit the act or be negligent for vicarious liability to apply. Example of vicarious liability: if a delivery driver causes an accident while making deliveries for their company, the employers may be held responsible. However, if the driver was running a personal errand during working hours, the employer must not be liable. This role is important in employment law and tort law to ensure fairness and protect people affected by wrongful act. Elements needed to establish vicarious liability. Elements needed to establish vicarious liability. To prove that vicarious liability applies in a legal case, certain conditions must be met. These ensures that the employer or principals and not just the employee is held responsible for the wrongful act. Existence of a relationship. For vicarious liability to apply, the wrongdone must have an official working relationship with the employer. The most common relationship is employee employer-employee courts may also consider relationship like principal-agent, where someone is authorized to act on behalf of another. Key factors courts consider in the person and employers or an independent contractor. Does the employer control the worker's activities? Court may use the control test, integration test, or economic reality test to decide if a person is an employer. Example, ready mixed concrete 1968, the court chose to economic reality test to decide whether a truck driver was employed or an independent contractor. Tort of wrongful act uh, for vicarious liability to apply, the employee must have committed a wrongful act. This can include negligence, harassment, assault, or discrimination. This act can be either intentional or unintentional, but it must be legally recognized as wrongful. Case example, Lister versus Hasley Hall Limited, 2001. A school employee committed abuse. The court ruled that the employer was liable because the wrongful act was closely related to the employee's job. Act committed in the court of employment. The wrongful act must have been committed while the employee was performing their job. To decide this, court consider, was the act authorized by the employer? Was the act closely related to the employee's job duties? Did it happen during working hours or using the employee's resources? Case example, we discussed previously as well. A supermarket employee assaulted a customer. The court ruled that the employee was responsible because the assault was closely connected to the employee's job. However, if the employee does something completely unrelated to their job, often called a personal frolic, the employer is not held responsible. Close connection test and foreseeability. Courts use the close connection test to determine if the wrongful act is sufficiently connected to the employee's job. The wrongful act does not have to be part of the employee's official job description, but it must be connected enough that the employer should be responsible. A bus driver example who negligently injured a passenger while driving a company bus is closely connected to their employment, so the employer can be held liable. Foreseeability. This means that the employer's liability may depend on whether they could have predicted the wrongful act based on the nature of the job. If the employer places an employee in a situation where wrongdoing is likely, they may be held responsible. Uh, Example case law is Cox and Ministry of Justice 2016. The Ministry of Justice was held liable for the negligence of a prisoner performing work because the risk of wrongdoing was foreseeable. Conclusion for this section: to hold an employ vicariously liability, a legal case proves a relationship exists between the employer and the persons who committed the act. A wrongful act occurred, then the act happened during employment, then there is a close connection between the act and employee job. So the act was foreseeable based on the work environment. This rule ensures the employees take responsibility for their employees' work-related actions, balancing victims' rights and the with fair employee accountability. Any questions so far about this section? Okay. Next one is 3.3, analysis of the test for identifying employment statute. Analyzing the test for identifying employment statute, determining whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor is important for deciding whether an employee can be held responsible for their actions, vicarious liability. Court choose different tests to figure out employment statute. Each test has strengths and weaknesses depending on the situations. Control test. The control test looks at how much control the employer has over the workers. There is a key question is duties the employers decide how, when, and where the worker does their job. Can the employer supervise and direct the worker's task? Does the employers have the power to discipline the worker? Advantage, simple and easy to apply in traditional jobs where employees directly supervise workers. Helpful in case where employees follow strict company instructions. Limitation, no effective for modern jobs where workers have more freedom, for example, doctors or IT consultants. Fails to account for flexible or hybrid work arrangement. Case example, Evans versus Knox 1880, the court decided that a person under strict supervision was an employee. Integration tests. The integration test checks whether a worker role is essential to the company's main business. Questions: is the worker jobs core part of the company's? Is the worker part of the company's structure, or do they work separately? Advantages: helps distinguish employees from independent contractors, recognize the importance of workers' role in business. Limitations: some independent contractor may have important rule but are not controlled by the company, can be unclear for rules that are partly integrated and partly independent. Case law examples: Stevenson, Jordan, and Harrison Limited versus McDonald and Evans. 1952, the court said that employees are fully integrated but independent contractors work externally. Economic reality. These texts look at financial and practical aspects of a worker's jobs. Key questions: how is the worker paid? Who provide tools, equipment, and resources? Does the worker take financial risk like an independent business owner? Who is responsible for taxes and insurance? Advantages: give a full picture of the working relationship, works well for modern jobs, including gig economy work like freelance and Uber drivers. Limitations: difficult to apply since different cases may weigh factors differently, can lead to inconsistent result. Case examples: ready mix concrete 1968. The court decided that workers was an independent contractor because they had financial independence and provide their own tools. Mutuality of obligation test, mutuality of obligation test. The test checks whether the employee must give work and the workers must accept it. Key question: if the employer is required to provide work, is the worker obligated to accept it? Advantage: helps determine long-term employment relationship, distinguishes casual workers and freelancer from full-time employee. Limitations: hard to apply in case where contracts are flexible or 0 hour. For example, part-time gigs workers. does not always fit modern work patterns. For example, case example is Carmichael and National Power PLC 1999. Tour guides who worked only when needed were not employed because they had no mutual obligation. Any questions so far? Close connection test. This test is mainly used for vicarious liabilities cases, but it can also help determine employment status. Key idea: the worker jobs be closely connected to the company's main activities. Advantages: reflects real work relationships instead of just contract terms. Prevents companies from avoiding responsibility for workers closely tied to their businesses. Limitations can be objectives: what counts as a close connection, not used alone to decide employment status. Case examples: Cox versus Ministry of Justice 2006, 2016. The court decided that prisoners working in a prison had a relationship similar to employment. Any question so far? Comparative analysis, control test, uh, simple and clear for traditional job, limitations no effective for skills or flexible jobs. Best use case: mutual labor and direct supervision. Integration test focuses on workers' role in companies. Limitations: overlook independent contractors with important rules. And key cases: best use case, core versus principal work. Economic reality test provide a full view of the relationship, uh, highly identify ongoing employment, maturity of our obligation as well. So complex and sometimes inconsistent, hard to apply in flexible contract. First, gig uh, economy and flexible jobs, and maturity of obligation is accessing continuity employment. Close connection test aligns liability with closely related roles. Limitations are subjective and like precisions. Uh, Best use case: supplementary in complex cases. Right. Conclusion for this section: employment status is important for determining whether a employer is responsible for a worker's wrongful acts. Courts use different tests, and no single test is perfect. The best approach is to use a combination of those tests to get a clear picture of the working relationship. As work arrangements become more flexible, gig economy, remote work, freelancing, court adopt their approach to balance fairness and accountability. Any questions so far? Any concerns? Any issues? That's it for today. Here are some references, especially case laws. Also, you can uh, get some material, books or articles on your Moodle for further reading. So, uh, thank you for joining me this morning. I will see you tomorrow at 11 o'clock for our fourth session. By then, if you have any questions, any concerns or issues, you can drop me an email at yasir at ukversity.co.uk. Thank you very much, everyone, joining me, and I'll see you tomorrow at 11 o'clock. Bye for now.